once upon a time, tolerance was what we were hoping for in the 80s. Now I cringe whenever I hear tolerance, right? Like that seems like such a low bar. And in some ways, diversity becomes such a low bar today, but that's not enough. Like we need to include them, we need to celebrate them, we need to make sure that they belong, that they feel, that this is their community, not just that we are happy to have them in our community.
Welcome to the Race to Social Justice, a podcast that explores the myriad racial and social challenges facing the modern world, with your hosts, Keva White and John Kepner. Thank you for being part of the courageous conversation, because when it comes to combating social injustices in America, it is not about being confrontational. It is about being conversational.
Hello, John.
Hello, Keva.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of our Race to Social Justice podcast. I am Keva White, the Black guy.
And I'm John Kepner, the white guy. Keva and I share a love of the letter K. K for Keva, K for Kepner, and K for knowledge, what we try to impart in these podcasts, what Keva calls the K factor.
That's right, John. And the goal of our podcast is really to promote racial and social equity and justice through honest and even sometimes difficult dialogue, what we call courageous conversations. John and I have found our discussions with each other to have deepened our respective understandings of racism and our personal responsibilities in that regard. And that has led us to invite guests to share their honest experiences and learnings. And we hope these conversations will help our listeners, even our guests, in their own journeys. So who are our guests today, John?
Well, I'm going to introduce our one of our guests and then ask her to introduce one of our other guests and then ask you to introduce. But the genesis for this podcast came about a year ago. I happened to have the pleasure of serving on the board of Gwynedd Mercy University, which is a nearby university. And at our board retreat, which we always have a session focused on mission, we had a session convened by our first guest, Tatiana Diaz, who is the Assistant Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And it was she invited us guests to work with us in a session, the trustees, faculty, and students. And it was quite an impressive session that we had where she profiled, and I'm going to ask her to talk about it later, this diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan that she had helped develop, but developed it, with input from the faculty and buy-in from the faculty and the board, and also this, very importantly, the students. And so that gave me the idea, well, we really have been inviting lots of people for our podcast, Keva, but wouldn't it be fun and wouldn't it be educational for everybody to hear the young person's perspective? We often ask our guests, how do they remain, and they, working in the trenches in this area, how do they remain hopeful? And the idea of having this podcast was endorsed by a podcast that's just about to be released, where our participants said, well, we are hopeful because the young people that we work with are the future. And that's where we find hope, because of all the potential that they have to help advance racial and social equity. So Tatiana, before she joined us at Gwynedd Mercy, was at Cedar Crest College up in Allentown, where she was Director of Diversity and Inclusion. And prior to Cedar Crest, she served as Director of the Student Center for Inclusion and Culture at Drexel University here in Philadelphia, and as the inaugural Director of Multicultural Programs at Messiah College. She earned her bachelor's degree in political science with a minor in women's studies, and she has a master's degree in community psychology and social change. From both of these degrees are from Penn State University. In addition, she holds a certificate of diversity and community and another in LGBT health. So what a resume to start out with, but wait till you hear from her. So Tatiana, could you introduce the student that you've brought here today?
Sure. So thank you both, Keva and John, for the invitation. I've been looking forward to having this conversation with all of you for a bit, and so thank you so much. But as John, you were sharing, I think a lot of the reasons why sometimes we do the work that we do and we stay doing the work that this really hard work is because we're hoping that we are creating in our students and the young people, and individuals that will in the future hopefully help us change the world and continue in this process. And so the Natalie Navarro, she is a senior nursing student with a minor in psychology. And when I joined Gwinnett, she was one of those students that from the get-go was really active and immediately was engaged. But more importantly, in the last year, when in her junior year, she worked in my office as my student worker, and we worked hand in hand in moving some of the efforts from our larger diversity, equity, and inclusion plan. And she was I would say my left and my right hand over that year. And so I'm really excited to introduce you all to the Natalie, a young woman that I think has a lot of potential, not just in her nursing future, but just as an amazing, thoughtful, caring, and just aware individual.
Welcome to Natalie. I have the pleasure of introducing Miss Annette Netta. She is currently pursuing her Master's of Social Work degree. I met Annette while teaching at Rutgers. She's a Rutgers University student, and she was in one of my online courses, Generalist Social Practice 2. Very motivated, very dedicated student to the field of social work and social justice. Just has a good compassion and good heart for people and want to see a society to be a better place. And I think more importantly, she is a new mom, just had a beautiful baby boy. And I know Annette will share her story about why it's important for her to be in this discussion to build a brighter future for her son as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. She was just a joy to work with. If I could have gave an A+, she would have received the A+, but the grading rubric doesn't allow you to do A+ over at Rutgers. But she is just awesome person. And one thing I can tell you, I really enjoyed working with Annette is I'm a firm believer that when you ask the right questions as a student, you can get the right answers. And I'm open to questions. I always encourage the students, just ask questions. If you have any problems or any concerns, please feel free to reach out. And she took advantage of that, always asking the right questions. And I always encourage the students to increase and enhance their critical thinking and critical analysis. And she definitely has proven that. And I'm super supportive of her pursuing her master's degree in social work. I think she'll be a great addition to the field of social work and social services. So Annette is going to be our tag team partner from a student's perspective today.
And I'll just add that Annette is not, for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, she is not on the screen. She's listening because she's doing tag team with the baby. But anyway, so let's get started. And what we like to do in these podcasts is start with the origin stories. So Tatiana, could you tell us about your upbringing, going back to when you were a little girl, and how your upbringing kind of, if this is the case, led you to what you're currently doing professionally?
Sure. So I'm actually an immigrant. I grew up and was born in Colombia, South America, and I came to the US as an international student. So John, you shared that I'm a Penn State graduate. I joined Penn State as a junior, so I transferred in. And so when I got here, I think when I think about my racial awareness journey, it starts in the US, right? Race is such a key part of of just the history and how we live in the US. And it was interesting to go from being Colombian to being Latina, to being Colombian to being a woman of color, and to start to understand what that meant as an immigrant. Because that was not my awareness. When they tell you the American dream, it doesn't come with a racial lens. It comes, pretty whitewashed. And so when you look like I do, there is a level of you have to catch up in becoming and being understanding of why people may treat you in a certain way and look at you in a certain way in the middle of Pennsylvania. And that wasn't part of the brochure when you go into college. But I think one of the reasons why I do the work that I do is because I was thankful enough to be surrounded by fellow students who were passionate and forgiving and willing to share their experiences with me and guide me. And also I was able to find some key staff and faculty who were also willing to lend me a hand and help me understand this new reality that I was now a part of. College was also a key part for me to, gain language. I understood oppression and I understood sexism, and I understood, you had lived that as a young person, but you didn't have the language to have a conversation about it. And once I had that language, I wanted to use it. So my first career out of college was working with minoritized populations in violence against women arena. So I worked in domestic violence and sexual violence. But as you've said before, I really at some point wanted to work with young people and really try to work with those young individuals before they were marginalized in the sense that were victimized in the ways that I was working with them before. So college became that great arena for me. And so I've been doing it since. So that's how I ended up doing the work that I do.
Wow.
Terrific. So
that's awesome. So Annette, same question to you. Tell us a little bit about your story, your origin story, and what led you to seek a master's in social work degree?
Hi, and thank you so much for the wonderful introduction there earlier. So I originally, funny story, wanted to go into nursing way back when in 2019 when I first started my educational journey. I soon realized when COVID took off that nursing was not going to be for me. So I went into, I wanted to help people, but I figured that the physical wasn't my thing. And so I chose mental and I went into social work. I always knew I wanted to go for my master's of social work because I wanted to get the jobs that required a master's. And then in my I started my last semester, my last year rather, at Rutgers with my bachelor's, and I found out that I was expecting a baby due in May 2023 of this year. So I graduated with my bachelor's as well as having my son a week before graduation. I was debating whether I wanted to take the year off to, spend the time with my son and just, enjoy those first year moments. But I realized that I don't know what will happen next year. So I applied as rapidly as I could. And I missed the summer session, but I was able to start in the fall session of the accelerated program at Rutgers for my master's. I'm opting to do an online program because it's easier for my life with a newborn at home. Well, rather, he's not a newborn anymore. He's 6 months, but my goodness, time flies. But yeah, so that's how it got me to where I am right now. I'm starting my first semester now at Rutgers, and I'm due to complete it in December of 2024.
That's awesome.
Annette, is there anything about your origin story going back to when you were a little girl or your family or your parents that led you to social work?
So many different things. I was raised by an immigrant mother. She came here from Italy, met my father in her early 20s. She came here and didn't really speak any of the language, and she was very lucky to be able to attend school here. Like I said, she then met my father, and he was the Americanized one. And then they chose to have children, me. My father ended up passing away when I was actually 3, and my younger brother was 1. So it left my mom a widow with 2 young children, under the age of 3. So that really, affected just everything, of course, financials, emotional, my mom, again, was an immigrant to this country. So she didn't know American customs or schoolwork or how to teach us things, math, spelling, things like that. I knew that's what I really wanted to help people. I wanted to help people like myself. The more I took social working classes and psychology classes, I realized that was where more of my passion was. I had an act for it because I can understand different things and different perspectives than my peers couldn't because of my own personal environment and childhood and upbringing.
Good. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
So, Dematali, same question for you. Tell us about your origin story and how that may have led to you wanting to be a nurse.
Thank you for the introduction earlier. I think it was really nice. So sort of my origin story. I grew up in the Olney section of Philadelphia. If you know, you know. But I'm coming from a large, very loud, rambunctious Puerto Rican family. And we have always been so close. Aunts, uncles, cousins, basically grew up all in one household. And I spent a lot of time with them and got to learn a little bit more about my culture, even though we weren't on the island anymore. And that goes to that there's a whole backstory behind that, and more of how it's not really stable to live in the island anymore. So we all immigrated over here to Philadelphia. So I think having that background and growing up with a close family, and it wasn't until high school that I really sort of understood my identity as a Hispanic female, and having sort of a cultural shock because the middle school that I grew up in, it was a bunch of other Hispanics just like me, whereas in high school it was more diverse. You had literally every single race, ethnicity you can think of, and to be out in this sort of mini world, it gave me a foundation of who I am and how I'm going to impact the world. So during my senior year in high school, I was sort of considering where would I go and what would I do. So naturally, I've always wanted to help people. I've helped people since I think the day that I could talk. I was the one that was helping the students or the teachers, pull up the posters and do all that stuff. So I know I didn't want to be a teacher. I know that much. I really give it to the teachers. They're really great. But I don't have enough patience and as much fortitude as they have. Shout out to my teachers. I know I wanted to go more into nursing because I wanted to bridge that gap that I saw growing up between sort of the Hispanic community and the medical field. I think a lot of times, myself included, we sort of had a fear of going to annual appointments. And a lot of it had to do with language accessibility and losing disability benefits and stuff like that. So when it was time to consider university, I felt as though I needed, to grow and explore life sort of outside the city. And so I decided to go, up towards Gwynedd Mercy, which is not too far away from home, but far enough for it to be considered, far enough. So then as time happened and I got to get more involved in the field, it just solidified my idea of, yes, I'm serving as an advocate for these people in a time where they need it most. And I think that's really what drives my passion to stay in this field.
Tatiana, I know John mentioned this in your intro around the strategic plan, the diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan you put forward for Gwinnett Mercy U. How did you get that done, and what are some of the drivers of your strategy? First, I really like the fact that when you all talk about inclusion, that you included the voices of the student body as well. So I thought just hearing that was just a really good thing. But tell us a little bit about this strat plan and what are the drivers behind it?
So I'm the inaugural DEI assistant vice president for Gwinnett Mercy. So before me, there hadn't been a full-time person doing this work, which was pretty reminiscent to the time, right? Like in 2020, 2021, a lot of institutions, whether in education or out, we're hiring individuals with this type of background to do this type of work. Like, how do we do this? One of the key goals that was given to me as I jumped and joined this community in the middle of the pandemic was to create a strategy. Like, how do we do it? And that was, if you can think about it, like this is work that is relational and that needs to be community led. Yet we were in the middle of the pandemic. I joined the community having never visited the campus. I joined the community and was doing this work I didn't step on campus for almost 6 months after I was hired. And so a lot of learning the community, you can't do a plan of any kind, I don't think, even less a diversity, equity, and inclusion plan without hearing the community out. So what we ended up doing, our process, was really creating a wide a committee that included staff, faculty primarily, that had been in the university for a while, that we were able to, and from everywhere, from every single academic school, from enrollment management, from student affairs, from every area of the university. And we started doing a lot of questioning, like what have been the experiences of the students, the staff, and the faculty? What were some of the needs? We also look at a little data. In the time before I was hired, the students actually, BSU, who the Manley is a part of BSU, our Black Student Union, had done like their own kind of questioning and collected information. And so we made sure that we brought in all of the information that we could, both from the institution, from the students, from the staff, from the faculty, to inform the process. And then thankfully, we're not starting from scratch in the sense that there are some really good best practices, some really good, other plans across the nation. And so we were able to also kind of piece together what were some of the similar strategies that were some best practices that we needed to bring into the community. And so slowly we pieced together a plan that was then shared with the community throughout, for students, for staff, for faculty, trying to make sure that we were going on the right way. And even after we finalized the plan, we committed to saying, we will be continuing to collect information and to collect data. And if we need to change things, we will. So one of the key things is we committed to doing a climate survey. We needed some updated information from our students, from our staff, and our faculty. So now that we did the climate survey last fall of 2022, and now that we're reviewing all of the results, it is our commitment to making sure that those results and that data then inform now our strategies. So no plan can be static. The plan needs to be responsive to the needs of the community, to the new data that we have, and to the realities of the community around us. So, I think we have a pretty, I would say, It's a plan that is ambitious. It's a plan that is meant to be talk about climate, about student retention and recruitment, about faculty and staff retention and recruitment, about our curriculum, our co-curriculum. Well, it was a plan that was, in the title, it was like 2021 to 2024. Will we be able to achieve absolutely everything by 2024? No. But it is meant to give us a goal. And when we get to that 2024, which is we're right around the corner, we will continue to see what are the things where what is the goalpost? How much have we moved towards it? What do we need to do, continue to do? So, when we talk about racism, and that's just one piece of this puzzle, it's been alive and well for over 400 years. We're not gonna destroy it or change it or deconstruct it in 4 years. But we will make sure to continue to work towards being more conscious and really creating better strategies to living our mission. And that's what we're trying to do.
Wow. I just like the piece on you all taking the time to do comprehensive data collection to drive your decisions around this work. It is a process. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so it's just great to hear that it was very comprehensive in how you set the foundation to, construct the strategies around the work that you all are going to embark upon around DEI. So thank you so much for sharing that.
And then Natalie can share. Like she's our student representative at the DEI committee, and we talk a lot about data in our committee meetings. We look at a lot of data, but I think it's important for everybody to be informed and for some transparency to be present as we try to figure out what we're going to do next.
Awesome.
Yeah, what I looked for on this plan, Keva and others, is as a board member, is I saw a lot of organizations, during the George Floyd, sort of catharsis the country went through, just put out statements right away. We didn't put out a statement. We waited until we had the strategic plan, well baked and really worked on the strategic plan. But the really critical thing for me was, is this aimed at a cultural change? And it is. And culture change takes time, and reinforcement is not just developing a plan and putting it out and then that's it. It requires constant work at all levels. And so I'd like to hear about the student perspective, if you could talk about that. From your perspective, how did this play out, and what role have you played with Tatiana?
I think it was a very interesting process of how it was implemented. To give some background, I was a freshman back in 2019. So I got to experience the university before and after the pandemic. And seeing the implementation of this plan as a student of color, I was very intrigued, a little skeptical. I would say nonetheless very skeptical. And I actually took time and read the email when they sent out the DEI plan. And I was just like, okay, this is a stepping stone. Here are things that I feel like would work on a day-to-day basis. Just sending basic things like hanging up certain diversity flyers or things like that. And then there were other things on the plan that I was like, okay, it'll take a little bit, but I can see where this is going. So actually diving into my experience, and 2019, I was a freshman. I didn't know any better. I wasn't involved in a lot, but now here I am sitting as a senior, and I can say that I've been involved a lot in the process of making sure that the DEI plan is sort of implemented in its own sense. So I've seen the sort of shift that's been happening beyond the student body, like the student body and also curriculum based. And I think when the curriculum changes, I think that starts the conversations within the student body. And when that happens, that's when true change is bound to occur. So from my experience, I think it was in an interesting timing. John, I know you mentioned earlier, during the whole George Floyd and all that, but seeing that, a student-based club was able to sort of not redirect the conversation, but to get the conversation going and asking the right questions to the right people to ensure that the right change was implemented in a way that it took it on and that it actually happened and kept everyone accountable. And for it to be student-led really put the icing on the cake, because this is something that the community wanted as a change collectively.
And I think it you mentioned the faculty, but the curriculum. I mean, there are several drivers to this. I thought that was really an interesting one, and it's the way the faculty is working it into what they're teaching by way of examples and that sort of thing. I thought was really interesting. It's not just, we need to have a more diverse student body, or we need to have a more diverse faculty or a more diverse administration. That is a driver, that is a component, but it goes to the very essence of what the university does, and that's teach students.
I think we're lucky in the sense of being a Mercy institution. I've always said we have really good bones, right? Like both our mission, our student learning objectives, the critical concerns of the Sisters of Mercy, they really do provide some wonderful roots in which we can continue to do the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, both inside the classroom and out, right? So it is, I keep having the conversation with fellow members of our community where Mercy, which as a Gwinnett Mercy institution, we talk a lot about Mercy. But Mercy is our goal, but diversity, equity, and inclusion becomes a pathway to achieve Mercy. Right. And in regards to the academic, like I am not a faculty member, and I understand that faculty have ownership over their curriculum. We are not telling them how to change how they teach, but we want to make sure that we are supporting them as the conversation changes, right? More and more accrediting bodies at Keva, as in social work, as you probably experienced, like more and more accredited bodies include diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of their accreditation process. We want to make sure that we're supporting our faculty, regardless of discipline, in making sure that they're ready for when that accrediting body comes to visit, and make sure that we are also providing them with the development and support so that they can grow in their understanding, so that they can truly implement the strategies that they're building into those plans. And so this is not just a Tatiana or a DEI office effort. This is a broader effort, and part of us being systemic in the way that we are approaching this is making sure that we're supporting our staff and our faculty in how they're implementing this, both because of the needs of the institution, because of the needs of our diversifying student body, but also because it is the reality of so many, or if I may say so, every single one of academic fields that we have in higher education.
Yeah, I wanted to pull Annette into the conversation because ask just to see how you how you feel around your experience at Rutgers. I know it's you're taking an online course, can you talk a little bit about your experience around DEI, even though you're taking an online course in terms of the curriculum, your experience with other students, your interchange with other students, and just the whole learning process for you. just give a little bit of a concept about, context about your experience from a DEI perspective as a student at Rutgers in the MSW program. What are some of your thoughts?
Sure. So, being online only, I would think the biggest problem is making those connections, making the communication connections, getting to know your peers. Yeah, you have to, post and reply to discussions or do group activities, but like you don't really know the people that you're working with. And the best way to do that is if one of your fellow classmates or you yourself take it upon yourself to make, a group chat or something to have those kind of conversations with your peers. I had no idea how it was going to play out with my life change. So I'm just really thankful that I have supportive teachers and advisors, and I just kept the lines of communication open. I think that that's the biggest thing when it comes to anything for that matter, is just to keep the lines of communication open with everybody that's involved in either, whether it's your care or your education or anything. Just keep everybody involved, the lines of communication open.
Yeah, I see, because I could only imagine, so we're talking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and, taking an online course as opposed to taking an in-class course, that's diversifying the learning process. And then there's pluses and minuses that go hand in hand with that. So I'm glad to see that your experience online, taking an online course as opposed to an in-class, in-person courses, still allowing you to be successful. And I think that's indicative of the university's, efforts to make sure that regardless if a student is in class or in person or online, they're getting quality, quality education, and the curriculum is commensurate with the students' learning capabilities, and then the interaction between faculty and student is held at the highest level. So thank you for sharing that.
Tell us about your experience. What course was it, and what did you take away from that course? High level, takeaways that are going to influence, your approach to social work.
Yeah, so it was a generalist practice 2 course. As I said, it was during my last final semester. So I went from like literally the 3rd trimester of my pregnancy. That was that course. And I know that Professor White constantly found ways to educate our whole class on diversity and just speaking out and letting us know. He brought it into his work, into our education, and had us think about things and read articles and put it into our work, which is extremely helpful, because if you're not talking about diversity, if you're not talking about equality, if you're not talking about these kinds of things, then change can't happen. The first steps would be to talk about it, to bring it to people's attention. And I think that he did that throughout the whole semester.
The key to what Annette just mentioned is really the students, and most specifically her, having what I call a liberatory consciousness to embrace the information, because the generalist practice course is really just teaching you general, as it states, general social work practice.
Right.
Part of that is your ability to, as a social worker, to recognize your social identities and the social identities of those that you're going to be serving, vulnerable populations that you're going to be serving. So there's a certain level of empathic engagement that students need to have to understand the nuances and perspective of clients or consumers, however they may be called, and how to interact and engage with them. So even though it was a generalist practice course, I truly believe that DEI is a foundation for all social work practice, because, like the title of this podcast is, the race to social justice. And if we're going to achieve that, we need to have some knowledge base and expand our awareness of, diverse populations, particularly if we're working in a helping profession like social work and nursing, to be exact.
And if I could just add, I know that, like, for myself, I know I'm not 100% sure what clients, what people I want, what population of people I want to help. So having knowledge and having some background, or, to ways to know how to further educate myself in different things, as far as culture, as far as diversity, just different things that people experience. That's the best way to be able to help somebody, is to educate yourself into what they can experience.
Well, I assume that I know that the Gwynedd strategic plan, and I assume that the perspective in social work when we talk about social justice, is a broad spectrum. It's not just racial justice, it's gender equity, it's anything that makes people different. It could be disability, it could be religion, it could be ethnic background, it could be a whole bunch of things. So increasingly, and we have a society that it is very mixed in all those things, and getting more so. So it would seem to me that both in the nursing profession and the social work profession, whichever direction you go into those big categories, you're going to encounter and need to be prepared to deal with all sorts of different people very sensitively. It gets into the disparities of the way people are treated, patients are treated. So getting that's why I think what you've experienced as students is so important. And I wonder, is that resonating with you? And the whole idea of a second idea that I'm fascinated by is, and I think it came through in the session that you conducted with the board, Tatiana, is it's not just diversity, equity, and inclusion, but you want to create a culture where people feel they belong, and that includes the faculty. So I'm ranting. I'm going on a rant, but could you speak to your thoughts about that, the students that are with us, in your world, in the young person's world?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit more to that. So I feel like you can have the DEI of it. You can have the diversity, equity, inclusion, but I think a really big part is that belonging part. And I've sort of come to realize this through my sort of experience with the implementation of the plan. It's like you can have these criterias, but you have to sort of decide to have it there. You have to have this sense of belonging that brings everyone together, because with DEI, it can go a completely different way. It can turn into, if it's implemented in a way that's not strategic enough or anything like that, it can become divisive. It can become a point in which people become defensive of their identities. Whereas if you implement it with the lens of sort of mercy, the lens of belongingness and creating a stronger community, that's really where it comes into the nitty gritty, and you get sort of more support in that sense. You're not fighting tooth and nail to talk about, the different experiences that we feel. It brings this cohesiveness together, and it sort of like brings varying people together at the end of the day.
About belonging.
I think that's all any human being wants. I feel like I learned that very early on in my social working journey, that as a human being, we are social creatures and we all want to feel like we belong, whether it's in family, with your peers, and in an education, culturally. in all different types of ways. I think that the best, it's hard. It's hard. And I think that COVID definitely played a role. I feel like there's still recovering happening from COVID. I know I'm dealing with it just in my internships that I had from last year in undergrad and even just this year in my graduate program. So it definitely plays a huge part, wanting to belong and find people that feel similarly to you, that you share similarities with.
The whole idea of moving beyond just DEI and really honing in on words like mercy. If we can all have mercy towards one another, if we can all make sure that everybody feels a sense of belonging, I think that really just broadens the scope of what we're trying to, what organizations and universities are trying to really implement when we talk about doing this quote unquote DEI work, that it really moves beyond that. Because I always say, does it make sense to have people, a diverse workforce, and people don't feel included and they don't feel like they have a sense of belonging? What's the sense of having, along the spectrum of diversity, you have equitable distributions of resources and salaries and all of those other things that, pay equity and all those things you're striving for, but folks don't feel included. They don't feel like they have a sense of belonging. And I just feel that just leads to a dysfunctional organization, and it really doesn't help create what I call a harmonious society where everyone, feels like safe. We haven't talked about psychological safety, but they feel psychologically safe, physically safe in the environment where no matter where they go, school, work, in their own local community. So my word is social harmony. That's kind of like my platform, is how can we create more social harmony where people just can, dwell and commune together in a harmonious fashion. And so I like all of those words, particularly mercy. If we can extend mercy to folks, and just from a human being's perspective, I think that will help us move along this race to social justice that is the platform of the genesis of this podcast.
But I think that's also part of the journey of the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Or, we started with, we have the right to live. Can we have the right to vote? Can we have the right to be in the same schools? And slowly, part of this work, part of finding, whether we're talking about harmony or equity or mercy, is finding that, as close as we get to our goal, we realize that there's always something better that we can strive for, right? Because we are people, we're human. And as humans, we have grown up and internalized so many erroneous and biases and all the other things that in us trying to create this idea of equity or diversity or whatever it is, that we want to make sure that we are getting closer to it. And so once upon a time, tolerance was what we were hoping for in the 80s. Now I cringe whenever I hear tolerance, right? Like that seems like such a low bar.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in some ways, diversity becomes such a low bar today, right? Like it should be no surprise that we have these many individuals in a community that bring in so many identities. And as Annette brought together, the intersection of identities in a given space. But that's not enough. Like we need to include them. We need to celebrate them. We need to make sure that they belong, that they feel, that this is their community, not just that we are happy to have them in our community, which 100%. Is a very different thing.
Yeah. I think, this work is evolutionary, Tatiana. When I first started out back in 2004, you probably remember this as well. The term was cultural competence. So we went from cultural competence to being culturally sensitive, cultural humility, cultural intelligence, all of these like sound bites. But the question for me is, are we enhancing harm reduction in all of these terminologies? Are we making people feel more psychologically safe? Are we making people feel a more sense of belonging? Because to me, that is the end goal of all of this work. Is not these sound bites that we have and how we transition in terms of terminology that sounds good, it looks good on paper. So it's good to hear that you have a strat plan that has legs to it and is action oriented. It's not a document that you pull off the shelf 2 years from now and blow off the dust and and figure out what we do next. It's action oriented, it's driven by data. And so, I just think the work that we all are involved in is evolutionary and it changes, and data is really, I'm so glad to hear that you all are really honing in on this data drives decision concept, because I think that's the way to go.
What are the barriers? What are the troubles that you have to go through? What hurdles do you have to overcome? The key ones. I know there could be lots of them, but let's go around the horn on that.
I think, I don't know how to say it, whether it be a lack of knowledge or ignorance, because ignorance is bliss a lot of the times, right? It doesn't affect me directly, so I'm not going to educate myself about the topic kind of thing.
You sort of mentioned it, Annette, like sort of the idea of where would we find time. And I feel like recently the student body has slowly progressed into being beyond the student. We are workers, we are students, we are parents, we are taking care of everyone at the end of the day. We're doing so many tasks at once that sometimes we forget to take care of ourselves. So one of the bigger barriers, I think, from a student perspective is that idea of how are we going to care for others when we cannot care for ourselves? So you mentioned it as well, John, the sort of apathy. So a lot of the time students will feel so overwhelmed and just have this sort of idea that, why should I implement this? It's always the why question that shows up. And there's different ways you can go about sort of doing that sort of education, but essentially giving them a why or having them explore a why helps in that sense, because they're coming up to their own conclusions. They're having that human flourishing that students are still allowed to have in their college education, but they can still hold all those many roles still. Just subtle. It's more subtle. It's not very much in your face anymore.
Tatiana, how about from your perspective?
Oh my God, so many, which is the challenge, right? Like, I feel like you have the spectrum of barriers, like whether we're talking, like if we start with the student perspective of the Madeline and Annette were sharing, of the feeling of overwhelmedness and needing to take care of them and having the capacity, not the capacity to understand, but the capacity to engage in a really filled world, where you only have so much capacity left to engage into certain conversations that are are gonna be taxing. Especially with students and young people that have a very different awareness about, their own self-care in a different way that I did not have at your age. And so we need to manage that. I think when we talk about staff and faculty, we're actually working through very similar things. We've gone through organizations and individuals and who have been taking on additional tasks because of the pandemic, because of the post-pandemic. We as the professionals have also taken on extra things. We were also being asked to do additional tasks. And so I find that a lot of my colleagues are also pretty maxed out. And here I come asking, can you do this one more thing? And it's not an easy thing that I'm asking you to do. Is I'm asking you to, take a journey with me of like a year-long journey and conversation on racial equity. And then we're going to do a lot of thinking and we're going to do a lot of personal digging. And they're like, are you aware of what you're asking me? I'm like, yes. And not everybody gets as much energy out of doing that work, because it's a lot. It's tasking. It's personal. That growth sometimes is at the detriment at the same time of that growth can hurt sometimes. And then the reality of diversity, equity, and inclusion today is that it's very political, and there's a lot of very you're having conversations with your local legislators, and you have to be aware of what's happening in other states, and you have to be aware of the trends that your peers and colleagues are having in other institutions. And and in today's world, we also have to be aware of what's happening outside of the US and how that's impacting our students. And so you have to address all of those barriers, the individual, the institutional, the systemic, the national, the international, on a daily basis, in trying to achieve, the strategies that you wrote in a plan. And so it can be overwhelming, but at the same time, I go back to where we started. It is those moments when we have those wins, when you have that key conversation with a student and they get it, and they start to say, I see where you're coming from, and maybe we agree, maybe we don't agree, but I'm engaging in the conversation, and that makes my day, because that's the work.
Yeah, there's only so much we can expect a political system to do about systemic racism and bigotry and so forth. But I think Keva and I, one of the themes of our podcasts is that we look for, and I think it's been pretty evident, is that there's a lot happening at the grassroots, and you can't expect 25,000 students at Rutgers to all be, oriented to the right direction. But there are more students. My hope is that there are more students, more young people oriented in the directions that we're talking about, that will, over a long period of time across the country, have an impact despite all of those barriers. That's my sort of hope. We're getting near the end of the hour. Keva, do you have any final questions? I have one, but
I just wanted, it's not a question. I just wanted to
or observations.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment about, so we've been talking about the macro perspective, systems, universities, and and how do we, look at those competing elements as potential barriers. I was really thinking as we were talking here, drilling it down on the micro level to us as individuals, and like what can be a potential barrier for moving the work forward from a collective action standpoint, meaning having every healthy individual, mind, body, and soul engaged in this work. And to me, the two words come to mind for me is silent trauma. And, silent trauma, Tatiana mentioned how some of her colleagues, overwhelmed and stretched. And I just think about a person of color who works in either the helping profession of social work or as an educator, who sees images on the news of people that are being harmed, that look like them, that maybe living in their communities, and they have to go into these arenas and be their whole self and help others. And so, we kind of suppress our own stuff to try to help others. And I think this whole concept of mental wellness, we can't lose sight of that, because it's a real important part of being able to do this work, to look beyond the social narratives and all the things that they're saying and doing to, disenfranchised groups. And then if you are representative or a member of that group, how do you stay strong and be able to go in and help others? And so we have to, I think we have to also balance that piece. Because collective action is only as good as the wellness of all the individuals. And if everybody's healthy and ready to go, without all the competing things, we have families and stuff like that. Like, you know, like I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a teacher, I'm a business. And at the same time, I'm an equity consultant. And so I have to find ways to detox from all the social narratives and all this ugliness that I see in society in order for me to be in the right frame of mind to sit on the podcast and talk with some type of sense. You know, so I think that's very important, and we can't lose sight of the mental wellness as a potential barrier to doing this work.
I love the idea of Audre Lorde's radical self-care. The idea that self-care, especially as you described, Keva, of the folks doing the work, of the marginalized and minoritized bodies doing the work, that is not just the need to do it, but the lived experience on a daily basis, and understanding that we need to take care of each other. And sometimes radical self-care is not just individual, but it's communal, because our trauma, as you described it, is not individual.
Right.
It's communal.
Yeah.
And so we need to, as a community, take care of ourselves, but also of each other.
100%. 100%. Well said.
So the final note, that is well said. And final note is that I like to play with numbers. And Annette, your baby boy who's 6 months old, roughly, 5? Okay. When he gets to be my age, the year is going to be 2100. You can think about, I mean, that's hard. It may be hard for, so I have a granddaughter who just graduated from college, a grandson who's in college. So I'm very, as somebody my age, I'm not going to live to see the world that your grandson's in or my grandchildren are going to live in. What I would like to think, despite all of the the divisiveness in our society and across the world and all the things we're dealing with, that, I wonder what it's going to be like for them. And unless we continue to do the kind of work that you've been doing and have the kind of empathy and sensitivity that you all have, and can migrate that across large parts of our population and build a culture that is very belonging and welcoming to everybody, and that radical self-care is part of it, and group care, that's a nice kind of utopian thing I'd like to imagine will be the case. So that's just a different kind of perspective. It's been a very, very, very interesting and enlightening conversation tonight, everybody. Thank you very much.
Well done. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us for another Race to Social Justice podcast series. We thank you to all our listeners. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure you join us for another courageous conversation here on the Race to Social Justice podcast. I am Keva White, and it was a pleasure to be here with all our guests. Thank you so much for lending us your perspectives, your thoughts, your insights, and your wisdom. And at the end of the day, let's extend a little grace and let's extend a little bit of mercy, so that we can all live in a place of harmony. So thank you so much for joining us.
The Race to Social Justice podcast is produced, edited, and mixed at The Dream in Austin, Texas. Visit thedreamrecordingstudio.com for more info.